Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Scuttlebutt. I'm your host, Sean Hall, Director of Programming with the Veterans Breakfast Club. We're a nonprofit in Western PA whose mission is to create communities of listening around veterans and their stories to connect, educate, heal, and inspire. If you've been watching the Scuttlebutt for this current season, season 7, you may have noticed that I've had a fair bit of just regular civilians on the podcast. And I think that's in part because there are a lot of civilians that deal with veterans, that work with veterans, that provide different services for veterans. Well, this episode is no different. We have on Ryan Fairfield and Tony Lupo. They are the hosts of the Warrior Next Door podcast. They started this podcast because some time ago, they started interviewing veterans for the Library of Congress. Well, they decided we have tons of interviews. What do we do with them? So they started a podcast where they take snippets from their interviews and they had historical context, a bunch of facts, interesting points of view from their time with the veteran. These guys were fantastic. I'm so excited that I was able to have them on this podcast because let's face it, in the podcast world, there are only so many military podcasts. So to have two fellow gentlemen on that are both passionate about veteran stories like I am was just a joy. So I hope that you enjoy this episode with both of them, and I hope that you check out the description. Please go and listen to the Warrior Next Door podcast. You can also check out their YouTube channel where they have the entire interview of these veterans that they have interviewed for the Library of Congress. I'll have all the links down there, and please like, share, subscribe, and ring the bell on YouTube so you're the first to know whenever we release new episodes. And please reach out to me, Sean, SHAUN, at veteransbreakfastclub.org. I'm always interested and excited to hear from our listeners. And just as an FYI, my wife and I are expecting at the beginning of the year. So we will have a bit of a hiatus for the Scuttlebutt, but we will be back with new episodes probably in March. So thank you so much for supporting the podcast and enjoying Ryan, Tony, welcome to the Scuttlebutt. So excited to have the Warrior Next Door podcast join me today. It's always fun to have fellow podcast guys come onto the program and talk about why you guys are doing it. We've had a couple podcasts on in the past, but it's always interesting to find out, like, outside of the Scuttlebutt, what other military podcasts are out there. I've been listening to it. It's a wonderful podcast. Ryan, I'd love for you to start. Welcome to the Scuttlebutt. Can you please introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Ryan Fairfield, and first of all, thank you for having us, Sean. I'm married, father of two, I've been involved with interviewing veterans with my friend Tony here since about 2003. We started doing it for the Library of Congress Veterans History Project, and have amassed, quite a pretty good collection of interviews we've done. And so, as far as how I got involved in this and why, I've been, involved in the veteran stories, I had several uncles that served in the military. I myself am not former military, but always had an interest, and I guess it just kind of, permeated my life and, kind of bled over into this whole thing. So fortunately, having a buddy like Tony that I can geek out with and talk about all this stuff, and that, we kind of egged each other on to start doing these interviews. That's really what got us to this point, I think, for me at least. So,
yeah. And so I'm Tony Lupo. As Ryan mentioned, he and I have been collecting interviews as volunteers for the Library of Congress since 2003. We've collected well over 200 now. We continue to collect them. He and I both got to know each other as geoscientists in the energy sector. So we're both fancy pants name called geophysicists. And you don't meet a lot of geophysicists who enjoy World War II history or history in general, but he and I did, and we hit it off. We've got a lot of things in common. And as Ryan mentioned, our shared passion for history led us down the path of becoming volunteers and listening to oral histories, because we felt like the best way for us, at least, to not only enjoy listening to these veterans share with us their stories of their experiences primarily during World War II, but also to be able to preserve them, to make them available for shows like the VBC and for various researchers and future Steve Ambroses, right? So Ryan and I have been doing this for a while. It's definitely a passion project. I have a wife and twin boys, and they've been able to tolerate our chicanery for all this time. And so, being able to be on a show like this and hang out with a like-minded individual like you, as well as your audience, is something that is really special. We never take it for granted.
And I want to promote it as much as possible to the audience who is listening and watching to check out the Warrior Next Door podcast. You're going to have descriptions or links here in the description. You might be the first two geophysicists I think I've ever met. So you may have to, our audience went, huh, geophysicist? Right. So you might have to define what that is and why anybody would become a geophysicist.
Oh my goodness. So a geophysicist uses physical methods, physics-based methods, like using seismic data, which is basically an ultrasound of the Earth, or looking for small changes in the gravitational and magnetic field to help us image what we can't see deep within the Earth. And also, geophysics is used for planetary science to be able to understand what's going on up there. So if you can't see it and you can't touch it, you get in a geophysicist and he'll do the best he can to tell you what's down there or up there. Did I miss anything, Ryan?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, it's also used in the environmental industry. It's remote sensing, and, I kind of liken, using geophysics in the oil industry to being a treasure hunter. You're using it to, kind of pinpoint locations where you think something could be. And hopefully you lower the odds, lower the risk of drilling there. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes it's not that way at all. So anyway, yeah, so that's kind of what we do. But, I've been doing it now for, 25 years. Man, that's crazy. And so it's been interesting, but, this is really something, the veteran stories, the podcast stuff is something that both Tony and I, talk about all the time. We'd love to be able to do full time. It's just so enjoyable, and it really fills up part of your soul to be able to participate in this community, even though neither of us were in the military,
I imagine that being a geophysicist, though, there's some level of history there. There's a history, but is that like a good segue into like your passion for history?
You totally nailed it. And I was gonna jump in because I get really excited. I'm an excitable guy, I can't help it, which means sometimes interrupt people. I don't mean to do it, but it is a historical science. For example, when we collect what we call seismic data, we'll have hundreds of square miles of seismic data to be able to look down into the Earth and get an acoustic image of the Earth, just like you would get an acoustic image of a baby using an ultrasound. So in the same way we use sound waves to look at the human body, we use sound waves to look at the Earth. And Ryan and I have examples where we're able to image in these ultrasounds of the Earth geologic features like ancient mountain ranges in river valleys that are hundreds of millions of years old. We are literally looking at acoustic images of lost worlds that you can't touch anymore. And so, yeah, I think it makes a little sense that maybe Ryan and I would get into a historical type of a profession, being that we kind of love history. And the other reason I brought up the fact that we're geophysicists is the ethos for the Warrior Next Door podcast is two things. One, anyone can do this. There's nothing special about us. We're not famous historians. And that the stories that we have collected since 2003, over 200 in number, are from people primarily in our neighborhoods next door to us, all around us. That you don't need to be certified to do this. If you have an interest in it, get out and do it.
It's true. We talked a bit before about recording that I'm, doing this podcast, The Scuttlebutt, through the Veterans Breakfast Club. But it's so inspiring, definitely, to see other civilians jumping into their veteran communities just because they're passionate about the history and the stories, just to find and make sure that they're recorded, especially for the Library of Congress. This is something that VBC would love to get into, as we do have our own Veterans History Project. So we got to swap stories about that. I want to go back, though, to how did you guys meet, and where did the friendship sort of start when you guys said, hey, why don't we start a podcast?
Well, it's interesting. Tony and I crossed paths before we even worked at the same company. I was in grad school at Southern Illinois University, and I was just wrapping up my grad school studies and was getting ready to, I don't even know if I had a job yet. I can't remember, Tony, but I was in the geophysics lab at the geoscience department, and a guy that had just started in the geophysics master's program there brings in this buddy of his. And, he introduces me to him. Hey, Ryan, this is my friend Tony, and Tony was there. He's from Michigan. I'm from Illinois. Well, what are we doing in the same room together? Well, he was there to take the geoscience field camp for the undergraduate degree. So he was just a couple of years behind, but so I got to meet him, shook hands with him. We kind of spoke for maybe 10, 15 minutes. I don't know, something like that. And then poof, that was it, gone. So then I get a job working for Phillips Petroleum in Bartlesville, Oklahoma. And I'm probably 2 years in. And lo and behold, I have to go sit in on a presentation from a potential new recruit. And it's this guy, and he's like a bad penny. He just keeps turning up. And so he did a fantastic presentation on his thesis, which was way more cerebral than anything I'd ever done in my life. And we he got hired, and he and I became friends. Probably we were friends then, but we really became friends, Tony, I think a couple of years later when we were transferred to the same field office, and we were kind of stuck in the middle of nowhere, and we had.
Boy, this sounds so military. I don't mean to interrupt. This sounds so military.
Yeah, well, it's funny because we had a training program that we all had to go through. There was a boot camp, so to speak, with from the geophysics and geoscience side of the industry, and then they transferred us out to a location. We had to work there with that group of people and encounter and deal with all the headaches and frustrations of dealing with the cultures in those areas and stuff like that. So anyway, it was interesting, but he and I started realizing then that we had this mutual interest in essentially World War II history. That's how it started. And we got involved with the Commemorative Air Force. It's the group it's a 501c3 group that preserves World War II airplanes and stuff, and they had a small squadron out of Amarillo, Texas, which was just about 30 miles from where we were living and working. And so we got involved with that, and there was maybe, I don't know, 10 or 15 people that were involved in that squadron. It's a really small group. They had one little Stinson L5, artillery spotter airplane that they maintained and stuff. But we got to go for a ride in it. It was really cool. Well, then our company closed our office down up in Borger, Texas, where we were, and moved us all to Houston. Mm-hmm. And then we got involved with the Houston chapter of the Commemorative Air Force. And then we started hanging out with a lot of World War II veterans, and we decided, you know what? I wish we could talk to these guys without, appearing to be, fanboys or something like that. How do we talk to them and get them to tell us their stories without burdening them, or maybe making them go back and relive something that they don't want to relive, And so we came across the Veterans History Project through the Library of Congress, and that became the vehicle for Tony and I to be able to go up to a veteran and say, hey, we're doing interviews for the Library of Congress. We would love to interview you and get your story on DVD. We'll give you as many copies as you want for yourself and your family and your grandchildren, free of charge. If you will do the interview, then we send it in the Library of Congress, and your interview gets recorded for posterity in the collective memory of our nation. Yeah. So that was what gave us the gravitas and the confidence to really go up to these veterans and start talking to them, and it just started from there. What do you think, Tony?
Well, it was actually the Commemorative Air Force in Houston, the West Houston wing, that actually was the genesis for the Warrior Next Door podcast in two ways. One, we heard in one of the weekly meetings, one of the members for the West Houston Squadron, a lawyer named Don Johnson, brought in a veteran and kind of did the lawyerly interrogation thing and kind of did a
cross-examination. It was.
Yeah, cross-examination, and it was really cool. I mean, here's this guy and he's telling us all this really cool stuff about, his time during World War II. Mm-hmm. And so, we thought, hey, why don't we do this? And then that led us down the path that Ryan discussed about us finding the Veterans History Project for the Library of Congress and interviewing people. And our first interview, in fact, was a guy named Alan Sr., who was a B-24 waist gunner during World War II, who volunteered, to be our first interview. But while we were also at the West Houston Squadron, they helped run the Wings Over Houston Air Show, which was a huge air show in the Houston area. And they had an autograph tent, and they knew that we had a passion for history, oral history. So they asked Ryan and I to run it. And for a couple of years, we ran the air show. We had all these amazing people in there, like the Tuskegee Airmen and all these fighter aces and famous people, Tex Hill. But one of us, maybe it was Ryan, had an idea that, hey, we've been interviewing local veterans. Why don't we have them in the autograph tent? And we got a little pushback from, from the coordinator for the Wings Over Houston. They're like, well, are people going to want to get an autograph from like some dude down the road? And we're like, I don't know, let's try it. So we brought in some of the people that we interviewed in Houston. We made storyboards for them. We had pictures that people could sign, and people loved it. People loved it. The line for those stories was every bit as long as the line for everyone else's. And the genesis for the Veterans History Project as a podcast was there. It was the idea that everyone has an awesome story. And you don't need to go to them. They're already around you. Just go out, talk to people, document these stories, and share them with people. And so years later, Ryan and I were talking about how do we share these stories with people, right? Outside of the fact that they're archived in this vault at the Library of Congress, where it reminds a lot of people of like the Indiana Jones movie when they walk through the archives and the boxes are everywhere and who knows what's in there, right? And so, Ryan talked about maybe writing a book, and we kicked around some other things. And the idea of a podcast made the most sense for us. We can pull select clips from people we've interviewed, add commentary, add context, add a little bit of background to it. How do we meet these people? These were people we knew, right? There's a lot of podcasts out there that will feature certain interviews. But I mean, we went to their houses, we hung out with them. We went to their memorial services when they died. We want the genesis for the Warrior Next Door podcast is making sure that people know about these stories and that they're everywhere. They're all around us.
Ian, you hit the nail on the head. After starting with VBC, before starting with VBC, I may not have noticed how many veterans lived just in my block, and realized one day that there was a Navy flag flying right around the corner, and there was a big sign in the front that said "Happy 100th Birthday," and it was like, whoa, there's a 100-year-old, World War II Navy vet, who lives right around the block. And you're right, Warrior Next Door. That's why I love the title of your podcast. Were you intimidated when you first started the interviews? I know when I started with VBC, I was so scared of like, oh, am I going to say the wrong thing? What do I ask? What do I do? How did you sort of figure that out on the fly?
Well, I'll say, if you don't mind, Tony, I'll jump in. Like Tony said, the first interview we had was Alan Sr. And, we were talking with him at one of our squadron meetings. He's like, look, I'll be your guinea pig. Why don't you come over? And so we were like, okay. So when Tony and I go to Alan's house, we tell this story a lot, but we pull up and we're both nervous. We're like, what are we, we had a rigid list of questions to ask. We weren't into the free flow interview yet because we hadn't any experience. We didn't know how to do that. And so, we pull up and I'm like, all right, well, there's this house, all the porch lights on. Well, I don't know, you gonna go up first? Well, I'm not gonna go up first. You gonna go up? So we went up and we knocked on the door, and him and his wife Joyce were absolutely gracious people, awesome people, and we just sat down with him and got everything set up at his dining room table, and we went through our list of questions, and the great thing about Alan was he was able to go ahead and tell his story, even though we had these kind of terse little questions like, how often did you write home to your mom and dad, and things like that, but as we did more and more of these interviews, it got easier for us to, we had the questions bias at some point, but that was more of a fail safe in case we ran out of things to talk to the person about. Some of these veterans don't have much to say. Some of them don't remember a whole lot about their experience. And so you need some fallback stuff to pull on, to pull out of your hip pocket to ask them, maybe to jar something loose and get them talking about something, but, as, the Warrior Next Door, I'll just kind of tell this little story. All my life, I grew up in the really small town of Palmyra, Illinois. It's south central Illinois, in the middle of cornfields and bean fields and hog confinements and all that kind of stuff of the farming area of central Illinois. Well, right next door to me in my hometown of 750 people was a guy that I didn't know was a World War II veteran until after I started doing these interviews.
Oh, wow.
And he was literally the warrior next door to me, and I didn't even know it. And so I spoke to him and said, would you, actually, I think my dad set it up. Would you mind, letting Ryan interview you? He's like, sure, that's fine. And I found out he was a half-track driver during the Battle of the Bulge, and he had all these great stories. And he was, I think, the first guy that I interviewed by myself, and right there in my hometown and everything. And so, there's always these stories. You see these guys in your hometown, or like you said, Sean, on in your neighborhood, flying the flag, and you're like, I wonder what that guy's story is, and you don't really ever know whether, if they're flying the flag and they're wearing a hat. I kind of feel like that's a little bit of an open door to go talk to them.
Right.
Some guys don't even do that because they're pretty guarded about their service and stuff, but
yeah, but most of the people that we ended up interviewing was through word of mouth.
yeah.
Right.
So once we interviewed Alan, if you play all of our tape at the Library of Congress, we send the unedited stuff there. It's not uncommon at the end to have us on tape to hear the veteran say, hey, you know what, guys, you should reach out to so-and-so. Here's his number. Mm-hmm. And strictly through word of mouth, we went from having someone be gracious enough to allow us into his home and be interviewed to having so many people wanting us to interview them that Ryan and I at some point had to divide and conquer. We had to start interviewing people separately, and then we would come together at work and we would share the stories that we had. And I'll add two more things to your question. Thing one, I'm still nervous to this day when I go and interview somebody. Now, the anxiety is over something different. The first interview was just because it was our first interview, and I just felt like a poser, a pretender, right? What am I doing here? Why do I get the benefit of this man's trust?
Yeah.
Now the anxiety has more to do with, I don't want to screw this up. I don't want to miss anything. I want to make sure I capture all the things I'm supposed to capture. And that has led to the second point I want to make. Oftentimes, Sean, when we're doing the podcast, Ryan and I are listening to these interviews for the first time since they were collected back in 2003, 4, 5. And you probably know this is an interview. I'd like to get your take on this. When I'm interviewing, I'm listening, but I'm also having to take notes and prepare the next question. Ryan and I have gotten so much more out of re-listening to these interviews we collected over a decade ago than we ever did when we sat in front of them the first time. It's almost like we get a chance to re-examine and reabsorb even more of their experiences because of the anxiety we felt trying to conduct the interview. And now we can relax and listen to clips and share it with people.
Yeah, no, I completely hear you. And as we've been talking, this is my notepad of scribbled notes of just like, you go in with an idea of like, okay, this is where I think the conversation is going to go. And then, and anytime I'm doing research for our VBC, happy hours that we do on Monday nights, 7 p.m., I'll be sitting there, and within the first 15 minutes of the veteran talking, I'll get 6 other rabbit holes that I want to dive into. And even the ones that, like you said, some of the ones that don't have so much to say, you keep the ball in the air and you just keep asking questions, and something happens where suddenly the door opens and you find something that something either struck them while they were, deployed, or something happened where they wrote a letter home. And then I start to dig in on that a little bit, and it goes off script completely, and we end up in a completely different area, and you find this superhuman element that, boy, it gives me shivers just thinking about it, because suddenly this person is opening up to you. You're a complete stranger. We may never have met. We're talking on Zoom, but they're giving me a piece of their life story that meant something to them. And I feel like we always say at VBC, it's therapy in a lot of ways. And it's so good for them to just sit there and let it out. And we've had so many of those moments.
Okay, I'm a dog. For a segue, Tony.
Yeah, I'm a dog on point here. The other thing that we have learned that we didn't appreciate when we were, doing the interviews is that therapeutic effect. That, look, you hear this over and over again from a lot of veterans, especially World War I, World War II, maybe to some degree in Vietnam. They came home and they didn't talk about it. And I think the reason why a lot of people allowed us to interview them when they did is they were primarily at this time in their 70s and 80s, and they were kind of in their golden twilight years. And maybe they just felt like, hey, if they're not teaching this in high school, then I need to share it with these guys so it's available to future generations, or whatever the reasons were. But the thing we didn't appreciate was how therapeutic it was. We have learned through the course of doing this podcast about PTS. We were told not to call it PTSD because it's not a disorder, for example. and that the best thing that people can do who suffer from a traumatic event for most people is to talk about it, especially if it's with their battle buddies, with their people that were at reunions or whatever, to be able to let it out, that every time they talk about it, they feel a little better. And we didn't appreciate the whole concept of some part of these conversations that we have with these veterans can actually be like mentally helpful for them.
Completely.
And, yeah.
And
So,
something that's so interesting about what you're saying and that I found is that when I'm able to get actually somebody of my generation on to talk about the war on terror, wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, I feel like it's like finding a unicorn at this point, because as much as we want to get the younger generation on, it's like they came back and I think they're just ready to like have their job, have their family, and they don't really need to talk about it now. But I feel like in about 30, 40 years, it's going to creep back and they're going to say, I really want to talk about this. And that's where it's like VBC has staying power, because, or in anything, the Veterans History Project has staying power because there's always going to be a veteran who's going to want to tell his story, talk about what he went through, what his whole generation, their war.
Yeah, and to me, it's our job as civilians, as non-military personnel, to not only listen to their stories and share them and make sure that the lessons from them are understood, but to also make sure that these veterans understand that we appreciate them, that we're grateful for what they do. There's this quote from a veteran that said something to the effect that the worst part about being a veteran is having people not know or forget what you did, what your sacrifices were. And in fact, with respect to some of the therapeutic element of this, Ryan, could you share with Sean really quick a very recent example with a 97-year-old World War II veteran who landed on D-Day, where we kind of had a chance to walk with him along this journey for healing?
Yeah, I think Sean, you've probably heard through Lars, Mickey, and Nick about Bill Parker, who is a veteran that we interviewed. He was in the first wave. He was in the 29th Infantry Division, of the 116th Infantry Regiment. He landed first wave Omaha Beach on D-Day, and he's still alive, still around. I mean, there's just not many of these guys left. Well, we interviewed him here in this room actually last November, a year ago, and his story was just fantastic. We got 3 hours of tape with him. Then we were asked to go with him back to Normandy for the first time since he landed there on June 6, 1944. So Tony and I and our families went with Bill back to Normandy this past summer, and we're there on June 6. We stood with Bill on Omaha Beach on June 6, 2022. It was probably one of the most amazing moments of my life to stand there with the guy who was on that beach 78 years prior to that. Well, anyway, long story short, while we were there, he goes on the beach for the first time. He got to go on the beach twice while we were there. First time was kind of hectic. There was a lot of people around. He was, was with a group of other veterans, and you could see it on his face. You look at pictures of him now from that moment. He was frowning. It was a stressful thing for him to be standing on that very beach. But one of the things that was interesting was how different it looked now compared to 78 years before. Children running and playing, families playing on the beach. It was a very nice setting, bucolic setting and stuff. Well, then a few days later, on June 6th, we got to go back down on the beach. It was a nice sunny day, and same thing was happening. There were all these families on the beach. Everybody was gathered around. A lot of people were there because it was June 6th, of course. And when they saw this guy standing there who had landed on that very spot 78 years before, he was a rock star, he got to stand at the overlook at the American Cemetery, and he looked down on the very area that he landed. And he had all these French civilians gather around him there, and they all came up to him and were thanking him with tears in their eyes, And he said later on, at the very last day we were there, I went up to Bill and I said, Bill, how are you doing with all this stuff? Because he had been suffering from PTS ever since the day he landed. He saw a lot of horrific stuff. He, dealt with it for his entire life. Didn't tell his wife about it. Didn't tell his brother or his parents. He wanted to, but it was just not in the, it was not the culture to do that.
Right.
You probably know what I'm talking about. And so he held this stuff in his entire life. And it's like a pressure cooker. If you don't release the valve every once in a while, it
Yeah.
just builds up and builds up. That's why these reunions where these guys can talk with their battle buddies is a pressure release valve for these guys. Well, anyway, the last day he was there, I was talking to him and I said, how are you doing with all this? He said, well, you know what, Ryan? Um, last night was the first time in 78 years I was able to sleep all the way through and I didn't dream about dead bodies on the beach.
Wow.
And that was profound.
Yeah.
The whole group that was there with him, we hugged him and we were like, hi, it's the reason for, it's what we all hoped would happen, was some sort of peace be able to be given to him. And he even said, I did a follow-up interview with him after the trip, and he said that he feels like not only did that trip help, but doing all the talking about it that he's been doing with like Tony and I and with his best friend David, and the research we've been doing trying to follow his path through the war has really benefited him. He said if he feels like it's been really therapeutic for him to go back and kind of look at things now, 40, 70 some odd years later, but with people around him that are telling him, look, this is why you had to do this. He had a French woman come up to him at that overlook at Omaha Beach on crutches, and Bill was standing there overlooking Omaha Beach crying. And this French woman comes up to him and says, you don't need to feel bad about this. You don't need to worry about what the legacy is for what you guys had to do. She's like, you were safe in your country, living your own lives. And because we couldn't protect ourselves, our government could not protect us, you had to get out of your country and come over here and save us. And she said that they were immensely thankful for that. I mean, we saw numerous people come up to Bill and give him gifts and hug him, thank him. There was one fellow who grabbed his arm right there at the overlook and said, he was crying too. He said, thank you for saving my country.
Wow.
And it was the most poignant moment that I had witnessed to that point. So it is true. I mean, talking about it is what little Tony and I can do for these guys. But anyone that goes and speaks to a veteran, if they're willing, provides them an outlet to kind of get, release the pressure in a way.
I can't imagine for both of you standing there with him that first day. What do you can't, it's almost like you can't say anything. Like what can you say? Like us as civilians, that's the thing that I find probably the most difficult. And it's like, I understand that I will never understand what you've been through. And like, I can sit here with you and you can tell me the story. But I know there's that disconnect. I know that I'll never understand it, but I'm trying to find a way to give you a platform to tell that story, or an avenue to do it that's safe, that's and I think that's part of it. You can sit in a room with a veteran and talk to them about their story. They feel safe, they feel trusted, they feel like they can let it out, because otherwise it's like, oh, they might be, might not want to share these really intimate details of people that they served with, or conflicts that they were a part of. It's very, very traumatic.
I think the fact that we were strangers for these interviews helped us over and over again. We would hear people tell us who sometimes the vets would have their wife, or more often like their son or daughter, in the room while they were being interviewed. And when it was over, the veteran would say, I've never talked to anybody about this before. And their kids would say, I've never heard dad or mom say these things before. And I just think that some things are easier to say to strangers and battle buddies than they are to your family. A perfect example. My dad served in Vietnam. He was a weapons specialist on the carrier, the USS Ranger. He has told me things that have happened to him during his service I wanted to run tape. I said, look, I want to collect your memories. I want to put these, on camera and put them in the Veteran History Project, share them with our family. And he told me, he said, I don't feel comfortable doing it. I don't want to do it.
Wow.
So what I'm considering is seeing if I can get a volunteer from one of the local colleges who have these programs to come over when I'm not there and interview my own father, because a lot of these individuals, the people that they don't feel safe sharing these memories with, not because they don't trust them, but because they got a completely different relationship with their family members, they often will feel a lot safer with strangers and definitely with their battle buddies. So one of the things that Ryan and I say a lot in our podcast, because it's so frequent that we capture footage of a veteran talking about their struggles with their nightmares and their PTS, is we try to encourage veterans to talk about it, to find a group, to go get some help. And in fact, Bill Parker, this World War II veteran that we just mentioned, he went to one of these groups after his wife died relatively recently at a church called Crook of the Hills in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that area. And that's where he met his friend, Dave. And Dave has been the one who has been able to connect him with other veterans and people like Ryan and I to share his story and to help him heal. So, man, if you're a veteran out there and you're struggling with this, you have nightmares and you're having problems with mental health, the old school approach of just keep it inside and suck it up and rub some dirt in it, it's not helping anybody. Go find a group, go talk to some people.
And the interesting thing about doing the Scuttlebutt over the last couple of years is that we've had multiple episodes about different treatments for PTS. And one of the more recent ones, which I found very interesting, was a post 9/11 vet who realized that judo was a release for him. So he created the Knife Hand Company. I had him on recently. Then their whole mission is connecting veterans with grappling martial arts studios to experience some level of like therapy. They don't go in and tell their stories, but they do one-on-one grappling and feel like that physicality working with another veteran helps them to like get through some stuff. That was one of the more obscure ones that I came across, but I've just sort of been fascinated about it ever since. Now, it's so hard to say. You guys have done 200 interviews. What is the thing that you've learned? What, before you started the interviews, and what did you expect, and where are you at now, and what you've understood about the veteran experience?
Ooh, wow. That's a tough one. I guess, with all the veterans that I've interviewed, I guess I would say that, the probably the biggest takeaway for me has just been, I would say just what we've spoken about, with respect to the code that these guys are adhere to, and they don't really talk about it. Everyone has a great, each story, no matter what they did, they've got great stories. They have, things that happened only to them. And like Tony has said many times, each story is like a fingerprint. Each one is unique, and so you learn lots of great things about all these different, these various jobs and roles and theaters and wars that these guys and gals have been through and everything. But understanding just the personal side of it and how it impacts each one differently. There are guys that have been through so much that they don't appear to really, they hide it well. They don't appear to really be impacted by it like other people would have been with those same experiences. So I'm always marveling at how the individual from person to person can handle things differently. And I do think that that's probably their ability to conceal it a bit better. So it depends on the profession that they went into. Like there was a Marine that we interviewed. His name is Harvey Hunt. He landed on 4 Pacific Islands in the Marine Corps. First wave in 3 out of 4 of the invasions. He was on Kwajalein, Tinian, Saipan, and Iwo Jima. And the only one that he didn't get wounded on was when he was not in the first wave. It was on, I think it was Tinian that he got wounded on. He got shot right through the jaw and everything. And that guy was classic Marine guy. He went on to become a lawyer after the war. And I think that probably has helped him be able to keep his composure throughout life, when I look back on it. So it's always interesting to me when you hear about some of these stories, how each person has been able to handle their own trauma that they went through.
Yeah, for me going in, and then what I've learned is similar to Ryan. We'll have veterans tell us about some horrific things that they experienced. And for me, it speaks to what Ryan's saying is how resilient humans can be. How can you, if we look at Harvey Hunt again as another example, the very first beach he landed on, within the first 5 minutes, two men in his squad were shot in the head and were dead. And he and another guy were the only two that was left.
They hadn't even gotten out of the water yet.
Haven't gotten out of the water. And they just get out of the boat and bam, one guy's dead. And this is just some of the things he experienced.
Yeah.
And what I mean by the resiliency is, how do you come home from that and give a crap about whether or not your license plates are expired? You know what I'm saying?
Right. I've asked that very similar question from a couple guys. I'm like, you've been through some stuff, so you came home and probably, you don't sweat the small stuff now. It's just like, yeah, what can you do to me?
It's incredible to get a letter from HOA because you didn't cut your grass, right? With everything that they've done, you know what I'm saying?
Right. Yeah.
And the other thing that I learned is, this is something Ryan and I have heard over and over and over again. Every time we want to interview somebody, they'll say the same damn thing. I didn't really do all that much. My story's not that interesting.
Right.
I mean, we just had a guy on our Facebook page reach out to us because he and Ryan had a chance to meet at a homecoming that he spoke to. And we're trying to get him on the podcast. And he's like, no, he goes, I only landed on one island. I only landed on Iwo Jima. Why do you guys want to talk to me? It's like, what? Only? See, here's something that I hope every veteran understands. For someone who's not a veteran, who's never served in the military, neither Ryan and I have served in the military. Just the fact that you signed up for the military or were drafted automatically makes you a rarity. Yep. Because most people in the United States don't do that. Just the fact that you went through boot camp, were trained to do something that you typically won't do in civilian life, like be a sonar operator on a destroyer, makes you even more interesting in that regard. And then if for whatever reason you have to serve in combat in any capacity, whether it's a support troop or the tip of the spear, just being a veteran and experiencing the things that you experience automatically makes your story interesting. So for these veterans, they don't see it as interesting. And I can't tell you how many interviews we've started up by them saying, I don't really have much to say. And then by the end of it, Ryan and I are just like gobsmacked and our brain is numb from what we just heard. Yeah. And they're not saying that just to set us up for that. They really believe that they haven't really done all that much more. And I think the reason for that is because they had their battle buddies with them and they went through the same stuff, maybe even more than what they experienced. And so from that perspective, they feel like they haven't really done anything. But from our perspective and the perspective of the people who they're protecting, and we need to appreciate them, it's ridiculously special.
Well, and I would say one thing also. I think a lot of times these guys are looking at this from the perspective of, I know who the ones are that did do something, and those are the ones that didn't come back. And in the grand scheme of things, they feel like they didn't really do much, and so that might be what's behind some of that, but yeah, it's so true. I mean, I don't know how many times we sit down with a guy to interview him. He's like, well, how much, I'll say, oh, this tape has about 60 minutes of time on it. Oh, I don't know. I can talk for 60 minutes. I'm like, you know what? That's okay. Just let us, I'll ask some questions. We'll, you never know. Sometimes we'll pop in a total of 3 tapes talking to these guys, and so it's really interesting how it all ends up working out.
And I can add one more thing, just really quick. So, we're talking about, men who have been in combat and they've done some things and how resilient they are. The other thing that Ryan and I learned is that these interviews where they were in combat, but they played a support role and they didn't have these typical sort of war stories that I think people expect to hear from veterans or read about in the book. Yeah. What we've learned is all of them are amazing. Let me give you an example. There was a woman we interviewed named Dorothy Gibbons. And she was an East Coaster, New Jersey girl, and she wanted to join the war effort because her husband was off fighting in North Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And so she joined the Waves and ended up, so that's the Navy auxiliary, right?
Yep.
She ended up in Oklahoma, of all places, this New Jersey girl. And the base that she was working on was the genesis for the Navy drone program. She was working on a base that was developing drones, that had developed drones, that these drones had crashed, it had sunk ships in the Pacific against the Japanese in World War II.
Mm-hmm.
So here you got this person that did a couple of things. One, you've got a non-combatant serving at home, sharing with us some amazing knowledge about a program that I didn't know was the genesis for everything we're seeing going on in the military today. And the second thing she shared with us, she said, being a New Jersey East Coaster, she would turn her nose up to people from Oklahoma or whatever. And by being forced through a wartime service to work with and get to know people that were outside of her echo chamber, she started to realize, you know what? These people aren't so bad. And she lives in Oklahoma to this day. We think, Ryan and I have a theory based on that interview, that because the World War II generation came out of the Great Depression, went into World War II, were forced to live communally in many ways,
Yep.
and intermix with each other, that when they came out of the war, they could explode and work together and do projects that we've had a hard time duplicating because we care more about who gets the credit than getting the job done.
It's a good point. And I will echo that certainly, which brings me to a question, which this might send us down a rabbit hole.
I hope so.
But being civilians and having said what you just said, do you feel service should be mandatory?
Rhino?
So, I mean, myself personally, even though I have not gone in, I wish I had. I considered it when I was in high school,
Mm-hmm.
but for whatever reason, I was just, in hindsight, I wasn't mature enough to make the decision to do something like that, which is precisely why I should have done that. But no, I think a minimum 2 years would be great for everyone. I mean, we've had veterans tell us that. Harvey Hunt told us that other people have told us that at the end of the interviews. You know what? What's interesting is at the end of these interviews, I don't know how many times Tony and I will be interviewing a World War II veteran, and then at the very end, they shift to the Vietnam War and how upset they were at how the soldiers were treated coming back from the Vietnam War. And they look at that whole culture that was going on, that counterculture that was kind of going on, the war protests and stuff, and they feel like, everyone should have to serve for a few years. First of all, it gives you a shot in the arm of discipline. Maybe it kind of gets you, straightened up a little bit, but it gives you an appreciation for what this country really means, what you're fighting for. And so, maybe it wouldn't be the best thing for everyone, but I do think that, having more of a push, more of an incentive to do that, maybe you go to, you do it for a couple of years and maybe you get free healthcare the rest of your life or something. Wouldn't that be awesome? That would be, there's some things that I think that would be very beneficial for our young kids today to be able to do that sort of thing.
I agree with that.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I grew up, I was a scofflaw, right? I mean, I was definitely a misdirected rebel with no cause. And I wish I had joined the military now during those years that I feel like I wasted, just kind of not really doing anything, but just being a knucklehead. At least I could have, had a chance to interact with other people, appreciate different cultures, different points of view at a much younger age. So I think some sort of service, whether it's a military or other types of service that could be made available for young people to help other people, I think that would be great.
Yeah, I agree with that. And you reminded me because we have a veteran in our network, to go back to what you said about the Navy Wave. Julia Parsons, he lives here in Pittsburgh, is a part of a lot of our VBC events. She's 101 years old. She wasn't allowed to talk about her service from World War II because she is one of the people who helped decode Enigma.
Oh,
wow.
Her husband,
so awesome.
Her late husband, never knew what she did. He passed away before he found out. She didn't know she was allowed to talk about it till she walked through a museum and saw one of the encryption devices and said, you guys aren't allowed to have that here. And they were like, yeah, we are. It's an artifact. And that started this whole thing where she was like realized, oh, I'm allowed to start talking about this. And she remembers like the first time that she opened up about it with her neighbors. And, you know, we've heard that story of just like warrior next door, of just no one knew what she did until she finally decided to say, I helped decode Enigma. And, you know, we're constantly blown away by her story of what she was, you know, what she accomplished on the home front. You know, it doesn't have to be in the front lines. It doesn't have to be Battle of the Bulge or Omaha Beach or Iwo Jima, or Vietnam. You know, it's the whole war effort at that point. Everybody was somehow involved. Everybody knew somebody that was serving, as opposed to nowadays where you kind of be hard pressed. You know, I mentioned the 100-year-old that lived around the block. There's a gentleman who's my age who lives a little further along. That's Air Force. You know, was Air Force, and you know, I talk to him all the time. And I think that something that I've realized being a civilian and having this podcast and just putting myself out there as somebody that's passionate about veteran stories is that any veteran I meet who might see the hat or who might strike up a conversation with me, I immediately am able to just kind of go into like interview mode. And, you know, if I'm in the line at Starbucks, you know, or wherever, if they say like, oh yeah, I was Navy. Oh, you know, when did you serve? Oh, well, you know, whenever, you know, it's like, oh, interesting. So you were in during this time. And they are like, they kind of perk up and they're like, who are you?
Yeah.
So it's really, I am so thankful and grateful to the VBC for kind of giving me that confidence to step out. And for people listening who is like, you know, I don't know what to say to a veteran. Do I just say thank you for your service, or what do I do? You know, I've had the advice for them of just like, yeah, thank you for your service is nice. You know, most guys will say, yeah, no problem, and keep moving on with their day. I was like, but if you give yourself just a little bit more and you take a step further and ask them when they served or which branch or why, suddenly you open up a conversation that shows a little bit more than thank you for your service.
Sure. Yeah. One of the things Ryan and I have talked about on our podcast is, you know, to take these devices, these phones, and turn them around and start collecting stories in your own life. How many people know how many people listening right now know how their parents met? How many people listening know, yeah, exactly, know anything about their lives growing up before they met said parent? Yeah, there are so many things. When we have Christmas is upon us, we're going to be a bunch amongst the family members. Oftentimes it's multi-generational. You know, we can all start by taking these phones and either putting them down and listening to people in our family about things that happened in their past, because just living through history automatically makes some of the stories you can share interesting, in a sense that it's hard for modern, you know, how do we talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis unless we lived through it?
Yeah.
Those sorts of things. My kids ask me questions about the 9/11 attacks on the towers because they don't have that perspective.
Which is crazy, right? I mean, like, I'm only 41 to date myself, but I always knew at that time, I was like, my kids someday are going to come up to me and say, what happened? Yes. Where were you? What was going on?
And you know what's going to surprise you, Sean, is how old they are when they finally ask you that. My kids were in their teenagers before they started asking me about, yeah, I watch YouTube and I see these planes crashing into towers and we went to Iraq and killed a bunch of people. It's like, no. You're gonna understand this a little bit better. So to me, starting off by just getting to know your own family better, and then allow that to give you the confidence to have these conversations at the airport or at the grocery store where you see the hat on someone and you ask them some questions because you care about what their experiences are and you have an interest in it. And then you're right, Sean, I've had those moments where you have these conversations and this veteran, their eyes light up like, this dude knows a little bit more than just what's on my hat.
Right.
And then they really open up, and it's to me, it's magical when that happens.
Yeah, totally. And I would say last summer would be the first time after 2 years with VBC that I saw a gentleman walk by that I didn't know with a Vietnam hat on. And I just like, you know, out of nowhere, it was just like, welcome home, brother. And he was like, he stopped and he looked at me, he's like, thank you. And just kept going. And I was like,
that's cool.
Cool. Like, okay, like I got through that first one. And now I feel like, you know, you can say that, to more. For people who have listened to the Scuttlebutt, they've heard sort of our style. I come on, we introduce, we tell a bit of story, we hear about some obscure piece of military culture or something, maybe get some history. But the style of Warrior Next Door podcast pulls from everything, all the interview you guys do. But I love the element that you guys are sort of like having the interview in the background, but also popping in with a lot of context. Can you take me through sort of like what the listener should expect whenever they download your first episode and even your most recent episode?
Yeah, sure. So, what the model, Tony and I talked about this quite a bit when we were trying to figure out what our show was going to be. But, each of these interviews with over 200 veterans that we've interviewed, each one, like I just said, each story is unique. Each veteran was in a different branch of service, served in a different theater, served in a different conflict. So, most people out there aren't geeks like we are that sit back and just eat this stuff up. Most people, if we're lucky, they know about World War II. They know we won. There's a lot of students and kids out there that don't know that stuff. Then you talked about how, in high school, you were so frustrated because they didn't really cover World War II very much. Well, yeah. That's a self-inflicted wound. We should have had a whole class, I think, in high school on World War II history because it's made us what we are today as a country. It was a huge inflection point for our nation's history. But anyway, what we do on our podcast is we take an interview, we go through and we listen to it. Like if I interviewed the guy, I'll go through and listen to it. I'll pull out clips from the interview, and we make a list of clips. And then Tony and I will, one of us will do research. The other one's kind of there to be the gee whiz sort of guy. And hear it for the first time. Like a lot of times Tony will have an interview that he did, but I've never listened to it. So I'm listening to it. He's providing context on things. And I'm like, oh my, I didn't know that happened or this happened. And it's true. I really am learning things. And so what we'll do is, we'll talk about how the veteran got involved in the war, in their conflict, or however they were in the military. We'll talk about what was going on geopolitically at the time, whether it was the Korean War or World War II or Vietnam or the Gulf War, and we'll put things in context. Everybody comes in at some point in the story. Each person comes in halfway through the movie. If the movie is the war, sometimes they come in and they jump out of the story, on their own time. And so that's what this is. We say, all right, well, when so-and-so got involved in the 116th Infantry Regiment, he went overseas, Bill Parker, January of 44. Well, guess what he was going to do? He was going to invade France. And so we put into context what was going on, why France needed to be invaded, that sort of thing. And there's information in there for everybody. It's not just basic level stuff. We go into a lot of detail on some of the strategy. We go into detail on the weaponry at times. We go into detail on a whole bunch of things. And we just tried to provide a pretty colorful picture of paint a picture of what this veteran was immersed in, what their story was all about. And then we let them, of course, tell the story in their own words. We get complaints at times from listeners. They're like, just let the veteran talk. But then we'll get just as many compliments, like, I love it how you guys, stop and start talking about things. So it's kind of a yin yang sort of thing. So we decided, you know what, we're just going to do what we're doing. If people don't like it, it's too bad, but it's the sort of thing that we think is necessary. And it's kind of what we're known for now, is being able to provide a lot of background detail on each of the person's story.
And also that person that might say, like, why don't you let the veteran talk? It's like, there is the actual, you could go to the Library of Congress and get that full interview. Yes. So yeah, if you want to hear that, that's a great way to push them that way. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we have a separate YouTube channel that just has videos on it. We don't even maintain it. We just point people towards it. You can go watch the entire unedited video. I think the genesis for the format came from when Ryan and I were conducting interviews. We'd come back to work or we'd go talk to our families. And, as much as a geek I am, I didn't really want to sit and listen to an hour-long interview with questions. But what I noticed people getting really excited about, even if they didn't have a mind for history, is when they say, what do you do this weekend? Oh, I interviewed it, so-and-so. Interviewed so-and-so. What are you talking about? Oh, it's World War II vet from Never. Oh, really? Yeah. And I would just share with them a couple of the clips, a couple of the highlights that they said. And they'd be like, that is so freaking cool. So the idea behind the podcast is, hey, if you want to go listen to the whole thing, you can do that. But just we're going to pull out little dribs and drabs that can bring people in. And I really love the comments when people who aren't history inclined will leave comments on our Facebook site saying, by you putting the context, it helps me understand their place in history, what they're talking about.
Yeah.
And it brings up their curiosity. And not only that, but Ryan and I learn a lot when we're doing the research on this.
Yeah.
For example, the tipping point that we learned for the Nazification of Germany, which we got from interviewing someone who was a member of the Hitler Youth, happened with something called the Reichstag fire, where basically their Capitol building or their building for their version of Congress burned down. The Nazis blamed the communists blamed the Nazis. No one knew who started the fire, but it allowed Adolf Hitler and that regime to implement a bunch of laws that just turned it into a hardcore Nazi state. Well, did you know, and we didn't know this, that the Iran revolution, the Iranians we're dealing with today, that the tipping point from these, centuries of monarchical government to what we have today, a theocracy, what the tipping point was a fire as well at a place called the Cinema Rex, where almost 600 people burned, and the monarchs blamed the theocrats, and the theocrats blamed the monarchs, and a civil war erupted. So the other part of this is not only do we get to learn, or not, I'm not learn, but to be able to share with people some of these things and these connections, but Ryan and I are learning and geeking out along the way. So right. Man, it's a win-win. I don't know.
I think that it's certainly more fun to listen to geeks geek out because we're passionate about the subject matter. Yeah. It's better than sort of hearing like a lecture that's sort of like at rote and all that. I think for most of the BBC audience who's probably primarily Vietnam era, a lot of them podcasts, they just didn't exist. Like, what is it? Radio? Is it not? What is you just record yourself and put it on what's a YouTube? So, but as podcasts have become much more mainstream and people realize, oh, all I got to do is download this and I can listen to it like the radio, but it's subject matter that I enjoy. I think it's just a perfect medium. So where do you guys see the Warrior Next Door podcast going from here? From your more recent episode, are you reading through a story at this point? It's a multiple part episode of what are you reading?
Yeah, so this is a new experiment that we've tried. We're trying out here. Since it's the month of December and it's the time of Christmas and the holiday season and everything. So it's kind of this what we're doing right now is a bit of a story that is related to my wife's grandfather in a way. He was in the 44th Combat Engineers in World War II. And he was stationed, he was brought into the town of Wiltz, Luxembourg, right as the Battle of the Bulge started. Whenever the Germans started to attack, they brought his group in, who were just construction guys, cooks, things like that, to hold the Germans off while, as long as they could from this town that was built down into a valley, which is, we all know, the worst place to be if you're surrounded, right?
Yeah.
So, well, anyway, he fought in that town. He was captured. He was a POW the rest of the war. And my wife would tell me stories that her grandpa would tell her about being a POW and the fighting, all that kind of stuff. Well, just 10 days prior to the war, the Battle of the Bulge kicking off, was this story called the American St. Nick story. And it was the 28th Infantry Division who had a couple of GIs that decided that they were going to throw a Christmas party for the children of the town of Wiltz, Luxembourg, who many of them had never experienced Christmas because they'd been under Nazi occupation since like 1940 or 41. So they did this whole thing where they gathered all this candy and all these treats that were sent to the GIs by their families back home. One of the guys dressed up like St. Nicholas, which was their tradition there in Luxembourg. And they had this really big event there, and it was a huge morale lift, not only for the town, but also for the GIs. They had just come out. A lot of these guys were sitting there, had just been through the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest, and they were kind of convalescing in Wiltz. It was a quiet area, and it was right before the Battle of the Bulge. So anyway, this story has been written into a book by the author Peter Lyon, and I approached him earlier this year and said, hey, this is a great true story. It's really, as I like to say, it shows what the best of humanity has to offer at a time when we were seeing what the worst of humanity had to offer. you know?
Yeah.
And it was just a really awesome, poignant story. So, 100% true. And so I said, what would you think about us doing an audio, like a reading of your book on our podcast just during the month of December? And then maybe every year we could get new people, other like maybe first responders, maybe other, children of veterans to read chapters again. And we keep it as like a living document where everyone can read a chapter, and you can have basically it's people listening and saying, this is who we are, this is who Americans are. This they have a big heart. I mean, honestly, we're a giving nation, and that exemplifies it in my mind. So that's why we're doing this right now. It's an experiment in a lot of ways, but we're seeing really good response from it. So right now we've got the author reading some of the chapters. We've got Tony and I each reading a couple chapters, but we also have children of the GIs that did the actual event in 1944 reading the chapters too. So it's a pretty cool thing. The book doesn't exist on audiobook, so you can listen to this for free. And we'll probably pull it down after the first of the year, and we'll probably put it back up every December, maybe with new readers, and just kind of keep it as a tradition. Was what we kind of have in mind. So we'll see how it goes. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of the story of what we're doing right now. It's a different kind of thing right now. Not what
Well, I love that.
Yeah, I mean, and normally December, is something where a lot of podcasts will take a break or play encore episodes. And so, Ryan's idea to have people who are relatives of the actual GIs that are the main focus of the book, like Richard Brookins, who was the American Saint Nick. We've got his relatives reading some of these chapters, right?
3 of his children are reading chapters in the book.
Yeah, so we thought that was really cool. But where we want to go with this podcast long term is, I would lie to you if I said we didn't have dreams and aspirations of hitting it big and being able to do this full time.
Yeah.
But where we've landed is Ryan and I love doing this. Ryan and I are best friends. Ryan and I get a chance to meet every quarter, either in Denver or in Tulsa, and drink a lot of beer and catch up and geek out on history and share these stories with people. And our podcast is growing, but we're not looking for, this isn't death or glory. For us right now, it's just simply, we want to keep doing this because we enjoy it, and because we enjoy being able to meet people who have the similar passion. People like you,
Yes,
right? People like Ray Harris of the World War II History Podcast. He's had us on. People like Peter Lyon, the author of this book. I mean, we're having a chance to hang out with cool dudes like you because of this podcast. So why would we stop doing it?
Totally. And right back at you guys. This is another sort of deep question brought up by something that Ryan just said. The idea of, what did America mean to you prior to starting the podcast? And did you get a different idea of what America means throughout your interviews?
Ooh, you go first, Tony. You gotta think on that one.
I think some of the things that have changed for me is, I had a very kind of History Channel view of the military and World War II and combat and veterans. And what I mean by History Channel view is, if you watch various specials on the History Channel, and they used to actually play, historical documents and stuff, they were, a lot of it, quite frankly, was America's version of the story. You could be called propaganda.
Yeah.
In the sense that, a lot of it is from the American perspective about certain things that occurred and why we got involved in say World War II or the Vietnam War. And so I think my initial feelings going into this had this, I would call it kind of a superficial kind of John Wayne view of what it was like to be a veteran.
Yeah.
And over the course of interviewing these human beings and having them talk about how wasteful war was, and how some of the best people they ever met were killed or maimed, and how some of them in certain conflicts like the Vietnam War question why, our level of involvement. That doesn't make them any less of a patriot. What's beautiful, what I've learned about my change in being an American is it went from this idea that there was really nothing to struggle with. Everything was perfect. Everything we did was right, to appreciating living in a representative republic where I can have a critical eye towards what we did through these oral accounts. And I have the right to have a different viewpoint, or to look at other people's point of view. Look at what's going on in Russia right now. They're getting fed only one view. That's all they can know. One of the things that drives people nuts about America, and I know other countries out there see it as a weakness and they're wrong, is how contentious we can be. But that contentiousness, that listening to other people's point of views because of these interviews, is what makes this great. It allows us to correct our mistakes and reinforce the awesome stuff that we do, like the things for the American Saint Nick. So that's my view on how it's changed, as I've been able to hang out with a bunch of old people and have them tell me some really cool stuff.
There's nothing wrong with hanging out with a bunch of old people, and I'll say this:
like, you're doing it right now, actually.
That's right.
I took like a sojourn last week, and I was like, I'm gonna go play some chess with some old guys, and I went and sat down with them, and I had the best time that I've had in months. Sat down, they might have, I don't know what age they were, they might have been 80, 90-year-olds. I had a ball. I heard their stories. I asked them questions. I was like, this is, I don't need to go out to the club.
Old people rock, man. Ryan and I have listened to a lot of old dudes, and we freaking love it. But Ryan, how has your view changed? I'd like to hear this perspective. No one's ever asked us this before. It's a good question.
These are great questions. You're making us squirm a little bit. So I would say for me, prior to getting involved with this, my perspective was that World War I and World War II and Vietnam were all basically similar in the trajectory of the country. But I have learned that really World War II is the big kahuna in the room to our country's history. Aside from the Civil War and the American Revolution, so much of what we see and deal with today geopolitically comes right out of the outcome of World War II. Everything from our allies, which were our enemies at the time, Japan and Germany, to our allies at the time that are now enemies, so to speak, Russia and China, and also just the fact that the technology, the advances, how powerful it was, that this country, which was really at best a second-rate military, we still had horse-drawn cavalry at the beginning of the war. World War I weaponry, how we went in 3 years and 8 months from being a second-rate military at best to being the preeminent superpower in the world with a nuclear weapon. Yeah. That to me, that in a span of one presidential term, we could go that far. Wow. With everyone pitching in together and stacking hands to the moon and getting these things done is just amazing to me. And it just goes to show how the system that we have for our system of government, and when everyone really pitches in and helps, and we're all on the same page. Now we weren't all 100% on the same page back then, but everyone had the same perspective that was involved in the war effort. And man, did we get it done. It's just amazing to me. I marvel at that. I marvel at the stories of the veterans saying, Tony and I would ask them, well, did you ever fear that we would lose? And they say, nope. There was never a doubt in their mind that they were going to lose the war. They were like, we're fighting two fronts. How do you not worry about that?
Right.
But they knew we were going to get it done. That we're for one thing, our geographic location benefited us a lot. We were on our own continent, away from Japan, away from Europe. For Japan to invade the U.S., that would be a Herculean effort. They couldn't do it. They would really not be able to do it unless they came in through Alaska and came down that way. But man, more power to them if they want to try that. But so anyway, I guess my point is just that, is that it was such a huge, inflection point for our nation's history, who we are today, the technologies, the geopolitical situations that we have today, our status in the world, the living, the conditions of living that we have compared to other countries in the world. We're really, and a lot of that comes out of directly from World War II.
You know what saddens me really quick though,
Please.
is it really frustrates me, and this is the human condition. This is a United States thing, that we often need to have a crisis to get us to band together. I wish we could bottle whatever that is that happens and sprinkle it over or put it in our drinking water so we can do that. We can behave that way all the time.
Yeah.
What I think is interesting in history repeating itself is over and over again in just about every war we fought, except for the earliest ones, our enemies have said the same thing. Oh, those decadent, rich, soft Americans, they don't have the stomach for this. And they're wrong every time. They always mistake our openness, our dissension, our polarized politics for weakness. They don't realize the strength that provides by having the freedoms to have that dissension. And it's, I mean, going against America is like, you got these twin brothers. I have twin boys, and they argue all the time, and they beat on each other, and they'll do that until someone else beats on one of their brothers, and then the two of them go after them like a couple of velociraptors. so that's the other part about this whole thing. When I listen to these veterans and study history, that I marvel at as much, not just what we could do, but that people always misinterpret the contentious nature of American culture, society, racism, politics as a weakness. And it's not. It's our greatest strength.
Both so well said. And I don't think I would have asked that question of a veteran. I felt more comfortable asking that of two fellow civilians who have dealt in the veteran space and heard from the very patriotic people that have served and put their life on the line for the country. And I think that's the thing that has changed my mind the most after working with the Veterans Breakfast Club and hearing these stories and working with the podcast is, I think I spent a time in my life where I didn't feel very patriotic. I felt very counterculture. I felt very like, no, I don't want to do this, that, or the other thing. But I think the thing that I hear the most whenever I sit down and listen to the veterans at our breakfasts and on the podcast is I hear the story of us as a collective.
Yep.
This history we kind of keep going back to, and it makes me not sweat the small stuff, because some of the things they say are like, boy, I was so mad at spilling my cereal this morning. Why was I mad about that? Because this guy went through Omaha Beach.
Yes.
And two, other than not sweating the small stuff, it's really just sitting there and saying, wow, I am so much more proud to be an American hearing these stories and understanding what the sacrifices were, and knowing that whenever we stand up at the beginning of our events and we sing the national anthem, that I feel really proud being in a room full of guys who are, and gals who are women who are, just so committed to this way of life, that whether they were drafted or whether they enlisted, it's something that really consistently sort of enters my mind when I stand there with all of them and I listen to them and, ask them questions and all of that. That's what sort of prompted me to ask the question of you both, because I thought maybe you've experienced that same thing of like, my mind has changed on the idea of what America is and what my role in it is, when I sit down and listen to the people who've served the country.
Totally. What I love is none of the veterans that we've interviewed have ever advocated war. Mm-hmm. They didn't want to be heroes. They were just doing their job. In the course of doing that, they have experiences that can blow you away. It's like, wow, that version of what America is to me, the imperfect version, the version where you didn't want to be a hero, the version where you wanted to come back, but you did it anyways. That's far more courageous than any of the sensationalized crap that Hollywood historically has put out. The real story of the American GIs and what they had to do by listening to these guys and reading books based on their stories, way, way more powerful than the John Wayne version, in my view. So I couldn't agree with you more.
And I'll say this, Sean, I feel like, with us doing this and with you participating through the Veterans Breakfast Club and all these individual groups, like the guys from the Logbook Project and everything, everybody's doing their own thing. And as the World War II generation, fades into history, and we're getting into the Korean War generation, and we've got Vietnam guys that are prime interview age now to talk to and stuff. It's up to us to keep these stories alive for the American public and for the world to listen to and to learn from. I feel very strongly that, the baton is being passed, in a sense, to people like us to make sure that we keep these stories out there and digestible, and we point out the things that we can all learn from each one of these interviews and each of these veterans that we talk to. So that's kind of when I look at what Tony and I are doing. I would love to be able, 20 years from now, look back and go, wow, we were involved in really a reawakening of some students to understanding and appreciating, World War II history or Korean War or Vietnam history. That's probably a tall order, but if I could help keep people aware of it in some ways, maybe because their dad listened to our show and they talked to the kids, that's worth it. I mean, I just want to keep it out there and not let this stuff fade into the dustbin of history.
And I'll follow up with, it was interesting, last week we had a in-person breakfast, and never had it felt so prominent in my mind. What I just explained was a Vietnam vet stood up and started talking about that same thing you said, Tony, that America needs that togetherness. And he broke down. I mean, this is a Vietnam vet who probably wasn't welcomed home, dealt with a significant amount of trauma through not just the war, but coming back to a divided America, but still has that ideal in his head of like, America really needs to get together. And you could see how passionate he was about that by him talking about it. And it just, I don't know if I'll ever forget that. Just like this gentleman who just, I wouldn't know him from Adam, but he just loves his country and wants everybody to be on the same page, working towards the same goal.
It just goes to show real quick, sorry, Tony, how you don't know what the other man's dealing with a lot of times. You're the guy sitting right next to you. Those guys have walked a mile in their shoes. We have not. We just have watched them do it. And it's interesting whenever you hear them say things like that, it puts an underscore to everything that we're doing, and we're trying to, kind of, educate people on the veteran experience. So, this guy obviously evoked a lot of emotions in you, in terms of, it sounds like his frustration, just a lack of harmony that we're experiencing now. Let me provide maybe a message of hope, because I am an intrinsically jolly, optimistic, happy person. And that message is this. And I heard this from a veteran I interviewed. He had an issue being called a member of the greatest generation. He said, we're all great. He goes, you put any generation in a crucible in the United States with our culture and our values. And he said, and people will come together again. People will rise up. It sucks that it takes a crisis to do it. That part makes me cry. That part makes me sad, right?
Yeah.
But I think that even with everything going on in the world today in the United States, if something were to happen and our young men and women were called to do what the World War II generation had to do, and I'm not disrespecting them, I'm honoring them by saying that it's not about their generation. It's about the cultures and the values that we have that allow volunteer armies to stand up and have to do what they need to do, whatever their generation calls them to do. That makes me proud to be an American, to know that we're capable of that whenever it's needed. And we've repeatedly have shown that.
And I think that after that, there will be people like us that will say, tell us the story of what you did, know?
Yep. I agree.
Boy, I want to give you guys both the last word here. I've had such an enjoyable conversation. It's certainly a highlight for me for this current season. But where can people find you? How can they support your podcast? Yeah.
So, we're on every major podcast platform, Apple, Google, Spotify. I mean, everywhere that you can subscribe to podcasts, you can find us. We also have a website called thewarriornextdoor.com. That's really just a page that has a listing of each of our episodes, and you can go there, listen to it on your computer for free, of course, and everything. Right now, I mean, we don't have sponsors or anything like that. We're just kind of doing this as a passion project, and everything. And we do have a Facebook page. If you just go to Facebook and you look for the Warrior Next Door podcast, you can visit that. You can like the page, and you can see us pop up in your news feed and everything whenever we post some things. And like Tony said, we do have a YouTube channel where we post the raw video of each person we feature. And I think we're going to be having a web page, like a real bona fide web page coming here shortly, where we're going to have a lot more content available. Maybe have everything all in one spot.
Nice.
Yeah, I guess my last word is I am so grateful to be able to share this experience with a friend of mine and with other people. I love being on podcasts like this, or I love the connections that are made.
Yeah.
By basically Ryan and I putting ourselves out there, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we're out in podcast land. Every gaffe, every misplaced intention, every stupid thing we say is out there for posterity, and we're putting it out there because we love connecting with people and sharing these stories with other individuals. And man, I really hope that your listeners take a few minutes to go check out our podcast. Maybe listen to the Marta Warner episodes that were dropped recently. And for
That's a
crying out
compelling
loud,
series.
yeah, go on Facebook, make comments, tell us all the crap we did wrong. That's fine. We're here to learn too.
Yeah.
But my parting shot is thank you for having us on your podcast. We hope your audience enjoyed some of the things that we're doing, and maybe we'll have a chance to speak with them in some form or another after they've had a chance to hear what we're doing.
Fantastic. I hope so. To our audience, make sure you check out the Warrior Next Door podcast. We'll have all the links here in the description. Just scroll down, click on, listen to, and also please like, share, subscribe, and ring the bell on YouTube for the Scuttlebutt, so you're the first to know whenever we release new episodes. You can always reach out to me, Sean, SHAUN, at veteransbreakfastclub.org with any comments, thoughts, questions, critiques, or ideas for future episodes. Always open to our listeners' thoughts. Thank you both again, Ryan, Tony. Been a pleasure and an honor. I hope to catch up with you guys again and have you back on my podcast, or maybe I can pop over and enjoy some on your podcast. It'd be great to continue the connection. Thank you again, and I hope you guys wish you have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
Thanks, Sean. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for watching this episode of The Scuttlebutt. I'd like to take a moment to thank both of our sponsors, the first being D&D Metal Recycling and Auto Salvage. They began as a small hauling and used auto parts operation in the Pittsburgh area in the late 1970s, but they've grown into a full-service metal recycling company with 2 locations, Lawrenceville and Tarentum. D&D accepts all types of metal, both ferrous and non-ferrous, that may be generated by industrial manufacturing, construction, and demolition, small commercial entities, as well as individual customers. They have a wide variety of material handling equipment and are capable of managing any type of job in a timely and efficient manner. You can contact them for quotes and availability at D&D. That's D&D Autosalvage.com. Thank you so much to D&D. They've been a sponsor for quite some time, and we really appreciate their support. The second being Tobacco-Free Adagio Health. They are dedicated to reducing and preventing tobacco use and to getting the word out about the hazards of smoking and secondhand smoke. They're all about health. So they want people to quit, and they have classes and nicotine replacement therapy and a popular quit line, which is the easiest number to remember ever, 1-800-QUIT-NOW. They also educate people, children especially, about tobacco use from cigarettes, cigars, pipes, chew, snuff, and other nicotine products like vaping. Finally, Tobacco-Free Adagio Health advocates for public and private policies that ensure healthy places to live, work, and play. You can learn all of what Tobacco-Free Adagio Health offers at tobaccofree.adagiohealth.org, or you can watch our recent episode with Tobacco-Free Adagio Health on the Scuttlebutt, where they talk about a lot of the programs that they offer for those who are looking to quit. Thank you to both of our sponsors for their continued support of the Scuttlebutt podcast. We really appreciate it. Thanks.